When Margaret Holloway signed her name on the deed for the abandoned post office at the edge of Bellwood County, the clerk behind the counter had paused long enough to remove his glasses and study her face like she was confessing to something shameful. $350 for a building the town had forgotten existed, sitting at the crossroads where the old mail route used to run before the railroad moved west and took the future with it. The post office had been closed for 41 years, boarded up and left to rot in a county that measured time by harvests and funerals, and Margaret didn't care that the roof sagged or that wild vines had swallowed the front steps whole. She cared that it was hers, that the price matched exactly what remained in the coffee tin she kept hidden beneath loose floorboards in her kitchen, and that it had walls thick enough to keep out the winter that was coming in 8 weeks whether she was ready or not. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret stood in the gravel lot that had once served mail wagons and Model Ts, watching her son press his palm against the weathered boards covering the front window. Daniel was 11 years old, small for his age the way boys got when grief stole their appetite and worry kept them awake past midnight listening to their mother's cry in the next room. He wore his father's old work jacket, the sleeves rolled up 3 times and still hanging past his wrists, and boots that had been new 2 winters ago but now showed the kind of wear that came from a child doing chores meant for grown men. The jacket smelled like Paul even after 18 months. Margaret had stopped washing it because Daniel slept with it clutched against his chest, and some things mattered more than cleanliness. The post office was a single-story stone building that had been beautiful once, back when this crossroads meant something and mail carriers stopped here to water their horses and sort letters before continuing into the hills. The stones were the color of honey in afternoon light, quarried from the ridge that ran along the eastern edge of the county, fitted together by craftsmen who understood that buildings should outlast the men who made them. The windows had been grand in their time, tall and arched in the way of old federal buildings, though now they were covered with plywood that had turned gray and soft from decades of rain and snow. A rusted iron sign still hung above the door, the words Bellwood Station visible beneath layers of oxidation, swinging slightly in the October wind that carried the smell of dying leaves and distant wood smoke. It was a Thursday, and Margaret had taken the day away from the feed store where she worked sorting inventory and hauling 50-pound bags of grain for farmers who looked through her like she was part of the furniture. The job paid $7 an hour, barely enough to cover the rent on the farmhouse she and Paul had been leasing when he died, and nowhere near enough to handle the back payments that had accumulated during the months when Margaret couldn't get out of bed and the world had continued demanding money she didn't have. The landlord had given her until November 1st to either pay what she owed or vacate the property. That deadline was 23 days away, and Margaret had done the math enough times to know that miracles weren't coming and that the farmhouse she'd shared with Paul for 9 years was already gone even if she hadn't finished leaving it yet. Daniel turned away from the window, his dark hair falling across eyes that had his father's shape and his mother's stubbornness. He was the reason Margaret got up every morning, the reason she kept working a job that destroyed her back and paid her less than she was worth, the reason she'd driven 40 miles to a county auction and bid on a building that everyone else had dismissed as worthless. Daniel deserved a home that couldn't be taken away, a place where he could grieve his father without worrying whether his mother could afford to keep the lights on next month. "Is this really ours?" Daniel asked, his voice carrying the particular caution of a child who'd learned that hope was dangerous and good news usually came with conditions that made it worse. "It's really ours," Margaret confirmed, though the words felt foreign in her mouth. Ownership was something that had always belonged to other people, to families with savings accounts and retirement plans and the kind of security that came from generations of accumulated wealth. Margaret had grown up in a trailer park outside of Millbrook, had married Paul Holloway when she was 22 because he'd looked at her like she was worth something and had meant it, and had spent the 15 years since then building a life that had collapsed the moment a tractor rolled on a rain-slicked hill and crushed the only man who'd ever made her feel like the future wasn't something to be afraid of. Paul had been dead for 18 months now, and Margaret was still learning all the ways that grief could manifest in a body that had to keep functioning despite wanting to stop entirely. She'd lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, had developed headaches that lasted for days, had discovered that sleep was something that happened to other people while she lay awake calculating how long she could survive on savings that had never been adequate for the life they were supposed to support. Paul had been the dreamer, the one who'd believed that hard work would eventually pay off, that the farm they were building toward would happen if they just kept saving and sacrificing and trusting that the universe rewarded persistence. Margaret had believed him because believing felt better than the alternative, and now she was alone with the consequences of dreams that had died before they'd had the chance to become real. The post office had appeared in a county newsletter that Margaret had picked up at the feed store, a half-page notice about surplus property being auctioned to recover unpaid taxes. Most of the listings were empty lots or collapsed barns or houses so deteriorated they weren't worth the cost of demolition. But the post office had caught Margaret's attention because it was stone, because stone didn't rot the way wood did, and because the listing mentioned that the building had a basement, which meant space that might be usable even if the main floor had problems. She'd driven out to look at it on a Sunday afternoon, had walked the perimeter and peered through gaps in the boards covering the windows, and had felt something shift in her chest that might have been hope or might have been the particular madness that came from being desperate enough to see solutions where sensible people saw only problems. The auction had taken 15 minutes. Margaret sitting in a municipal building that smelled like mildew and old paper while a board official worked through properties that nobody wanted. When they'd reached the post office, the auctioneer had explained that the building was being sold as is, with no utilities, no certificate of occupancy, and significant deferred maintenance that would require expensive repairs before anyone could legally inhabit the structure. The minimum bid was $300, which would cover back taxes and administrative fees. Margaret had raised her hand, had felt her heart pounding in her throat, and had watched with disbelief as no one else bid against her. $350 including closing costs. Less than a month's rent on the farmhouse she was about to lose. Now she stood looking at that purchase, trying to see it as something other than a monument to her own desperation. The building was larger than their farmhouse, probably 2,000 square feet on the main floor with the basement beneath. The walls were 18 inches of solid stone, built to withstand weather and time and the kind of punishment that came from serving as a vital link in the communication chain that had connected this county to the rest of the world. The roof was the biggest concern, sagging visibly over what had been the main sorting room, but the rest of the structure looked sound despite 4 decades of neglect. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Margaret had a plan, or at least the skeleton of something that might become a plan if enough details fell into place. The basement appeared structurally sound based on what she could see through the cellar doors at the back of the building. If she could get water running, if she could clear out whatever debris and animals had accumulated over 41 years of abandonment, if she could make even one room livable, then she and Daniel would have shelter while Margaret figured out the rest. It wouldn't be comfortable or easy or anything resembling the home they'd had with Paul, but it would be theirs. No landlord could evict them. No one could take it away because Margaret had fallen behind on payments she couldn't afford. Daniel had moved along the side of the building, examining the stone walls with the careful attention of a boy who'd grown up around construction and knew how to spot problems. Paul had taught him that, had spent weekends showing Daniel how to check foundations and identify water damage and understand the 1,000 small details that determined whether a structure would stand or fall. The lessons had been preparation for a future that wasn't going to happen now, skills meant for a farm they'd never own, but they were proving useful in ways Paul couldn't have anticipated. "The walls are solid," Daniel reported, returning to where Margaret stood with the deed clutched in hands that had started sweating despite the October chill. "No cracks I can see. The mortar needs work in some places, but it's mostly surface stuff. Dad would have said the bones are good." Margaret felt her throat tighten at the mention of Paul, at the casual way Daniel invoked his father's judgment as if Paul were just away for a while rather than buried in the cemetery 3 miles from the farmhouse they were about to leave forever. Daniel did this sometimes, spoke about Paul in the present tense or referenced his opinions as if they were still available for consultation. Margaret didn't correct him. She understood that grief was a language you had to learn as you went, and that children had the right to hold on to their fathers in whatever ways they could manage. She had bolt cutters in the back of her truck, purchased yesterday from a hardware store along with work gloves and a flashlight and the kind of basic tools that living in rural country had taught her to keep available. The padlock on the front door yielded after several attempts that left Margaret's shoulders aching, and the door swung open with a groan of hinges that hadn't moved in 4 decades. The smell that emerged was thick and complex, dust and mold and stagnant air layered over something fainter that might have been the ghost of paper and ink and the particular scent of official business conducted in a building designed for exactly that purpose. Margaret turned on her flashlight, the beam cutting through darkness that seemed to have weight and texture. The interior of the post office was a single large room with a counter dividing the public area from the workspace where postal employees had once sorted mail and handled packages. The counter was still there, solid oak that had darkened with age but showed no signs of rot. Behind it, wooden sorting cubbies lined the walls, each slot labeled with route numbers that had meant something when this building was the communication heart of Bellwood County. The floor was covered in debris, leaves that had blown in through gaps in the boards, animal nests built from shredded paper that looked like it might have once been official documents, and the accumulated detritus of decades without human attention. Water stains marked the ceiling in patterns that told the story of the roof's deterioration, but the damage was concentrated in one corner rather than spread throughout the space. The walls were solid, the floor level, and the bones were good, just like Daniel had said. They moved through the space carefully, Margaret's flashlight revealing details that were both encouraging and overwhelming. A wood stove stood in one corner, rusted but potentially salvageable. The windows behind the boards were intact, the glass thick and wavy in the way of old manufacturing. A door at the back led to what had been an office, smaller and more intimate, with a desk that had been built into the wall and a safe that made Margaret stop moving entirely. The safe was massive, standing nearly 4 feet tall and built into the corner of the office in a way that suggested it had been installed when the building was constructed. It was the kind of safe that post offices had used to secure registered mail and money orders and whatever valuables had passed through the station during its years of operation. The door was thick steel, painted black, with a combination dial and a handle that gleamed dully in the flashlight beam despite the dust covering everything else in the room. "Mom," Daniel whispered, his voice carrying excitement that Margaret hadn't heard since before Paul died. "Do you think there's anything inside?" Margaret approached the safe slowly, her heart beating faster than the situation warranted. Post offices had handled money and valuable shipments. When this station closed, had someone emptied the safe? Or had it been forgotten like everything else in this building, left to sit for 41 years while the world moved on and nobody remembered what secrets it might be keeping? She tried the handle, but the safe was locked tight. The dial felt smooth under her fingers, well-engineered and precise despite the decades. This wasn't a cheap lockbox. This was serious security, the kind that small-town post offices had needed when they were the only link between rural communities and the rest of the nation. "We'll need to figure out how to open it," Margaret said, forcing her voice to stay calm despite the curiosity burning in her chest. "But first we need to make this place livable. The safe isn't going anywhere." She turned away from it, but the image stayed in her mind as they continued exploring the building. The basement was accessible through a door behind the counter, stairs leading down into darkness that smelled like earth and cold stone. The space below was dry and surprisingly clean, with stone walls that had kept out moisture and a floor that was packed dirt rather than concrete. It would need work, but it was usable. It was shelter. Daniel had claimed the basement immediately, his voice echoing in the underground space as he paced out dimensions and declared that it would be perfect once they added some lights and maybe built some walls to create separate rooms. He was already planning, already transforming their circumstances into adventure the way children did when they needed to survive things that would destroy adults who couldn't access that kind of resilience. Margaret stood at the top of the basement stairs, looking back at the safe in the office corner, and felt the weight of everything she didn't know pressing against her chest. She'd bought this building looking for shelter, looking for the simplest possible solution to a problem that had no good answers. But the safe suggested complications, suggested that the post office might contain more than just stone walls and a roof that needed repair. The sun was setting by the time they locked up the building with a new padlock Margaret had brought, painting the stone walls in shades of amber that made the post office look almost beautiful. Almost like it was waiting for someone to bring it back to life. Daniel was already talking about what they'd need to do first, listing tasks with the organized enthusiasm of a boy who'd inherited his father's belief that problems were just solutions waiting to be discovered. But Margaret was thinking about the safe. About what a post office in the middle of nowhere might have been protecting for 41 years. About why the building had been abandoned so completely that even the county had forgotten what was inside. And about the old man she'd noticed watching them from the farmhouse across the road, standing motionless on his porch as if he'd been waiting for someone to finally open that door and discover what the town of Bellwood had chosen to forget. The old man's name was Earl Whitmore, and he appeared at the fence line the morning after Margaret and Daniel moved their belongings into the post office. Margaret had spent the night on a mattress dragged down to the basement, listening to unfamiliar sounds and trying to convince herself that the building's creaks and groans were settling rather than collapse. Daniel had slept better than he had in months, exhausted from the physical labor of hauling their possessions from the farmhouse and the emotional weight of leaving the only home he'd ever known. By dawn, Margaret had already been awake for 2 hours, standing at the window she'd uncovered the night before, watching mist rise from the fields across the road and thinking about all the ways this decision could destroy what little she had left. Earl had walked across the road with the slow deliberation of a man whose joints had been worn down by decades of farm work, carrying a basket that turned out to contain eggs and bread and a jar of honey from hives he kept behind his barn. He was 83 years old, he told Margaret when she met him at the property line, and he'd lived in that farmhouse since the day he was born. His father had built it, his grandfather had cleared the land, and Earl had spent his entire life watching this crossroads change from the beating heart of Bellwood County to a forgotten intersection that most people drove past without noticing. He remembered when the post office was still operating, remembered riding his bicycle here as a boy to mail letters and collect packages that had traveled from places he could barely imagine. He remembered the day it closed, too, and the way the town had seemed to grow quieter afterward, as if losing the post office had severed some vital connection to the outside world. Margaret had accepted his gifts with gratitude that felt inadequate, had invited him inside to see what she and Daniel were working with, and had watched his face carefully as he moved through the building, examining details with eyes that clearly knew what they were looking at. Earl had paused longest at the safe, his weathered hand resting on the steel door for a moment before he'd turned away with an expression Margaret couldn't quite read. Something had passed across his features that might have been recognition or might have been grief, and Margaret had filed that reaction away for later examination. The first week in the post office taught Margaret things about survival that 18 months of widowhood hadn't covered. She learned that stone walls held cold in ways that wooden farmhouses didn't, that the chill seeped into bones and joints and made every morning feel like a test of endurance. She learned that Daniel could adapt to almost anything if she framed it properly, that he'd transformed their basement dwelling into an adventure instead of acknowledging it as the desperation it actually represented. She learned that water could be hauled from Earl's well across the road, that the old wood stove worked once she'd cleaned the flue and replaced the rusted grate, and that human beings could survive on remarkably little when the alternative was having nothing at all. Earl became a regular presence during those early days, appearing with vegetables from his root cellar and advice about the building's quirks and the kind of practical wisdom that came from 8 decades of living in a place where self-reliance wasn't philosophy but necessity. He helped Margaret patch the worst sections of the roof with materials salvaged from his barn, taught Daniel how to properly seal windows against drafts, and shared meals with them in the evenings when the work was done and loneliness threatened to swallow Margaret whole. He never asked about Paul directly, but he seemed to understand grief in the way that old farmers understood seasons, accepting it as part of the cycle rather than fighting against its presence. It was during the second week that Earl finally addressed the safe. They were sitting in the main room of the post office, the wood stove radiating heat that made the space feel almost comfortable despite the wind howling outside. Daniel had fallen asleep on his mattress in the basement, exhausted from a day spent clearing debris and hauling trash to a burn pile behind the building. Margaret had made coffee on the camp stove she'd brought from the farmhouse, and Earl was holding his cup in hands that showed every year of the hard labor they'd performed. "That safe belonged to Henry Marlowe," Earl said without preamble, his voice carrying the weight of something he'd been holding for a long time. "He was the postmaster here for 32 years, from just after the war until the station closed in 1983. Good man. Honest man. The kind of person this county used to produce before everything went to hell. Margaret set down her own cup, sensing that this conversation was heading somewhere important. What happened to him? Died about 15 years ago. Heart attack while he was feeding his chickens, which he would have considered a good way to go. But he spent the last 20 years of his life carrying something that ate at him. Something connected to that safe and what's inside it. The words hung in the air like smoke, and Margaret felt her pulse quicken despite her efforts to remain calm. She thought about the safe every day since discovering it, had tried the handle dozens of times as if repetition might somehow cause it to open. The combination dial remained stubbornly functional, the mechanism inside clearly designed to outlast the building it protected. Margaret had considered calling a locksmith, had even looked up costs before realizing that professional safe cracking was far beyond her budget. The safe had become both obsession and frustration, a mystery she couldn't afford to solve but couldn't stop thinking about. "Do you know what's in there?" Margaret asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Earl was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the fire visible through the stove's grate. When he spoke, his voice had changed, dropping into the register that people used when confessing things they'd been hiding from themselves. "I know what Henry told me before he died. And I know what I've been carrying since then, the same way he carried it for the 20 years before that." Earl set down his coffee cup and turned to face Margaret directly, his expression revealing an anguish that decades hadn't diminished. In 1962, there was a mail train that ran through this county twice a week, carrying registered mail and payroll shipments and whatever else was valuable enough to require armed transport. One of those trains was carrying gold, Margaret. Not coins or jewelry, but actual gold bars being moved from a Federal Reserve facility that was being decommissioned to a new location in Denver. The shipment was supposed to be secret, but secrets don't stay secret in small towns, and someone found out. Margaret felt the room grow smaller, the walls pressing in as Earl's words painted a picture she hadn't expected. "What happened?" "The train derailed about 3 miles north of here, at the crossing where Mill Creek Road used to run before they rerouted it in the 70s. Official story was equipment failure, a switching error that sent the train onto a damaged section of track. But Henry knew different. He knew because he was the one who received the emergency shipment that showed up at this post office 2 days after the crash, before federal investigators had even finished documenting the scene." Earl stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkness beyond the glass as if he could still see the events he was describing. "4 men brought it here in the middle of the night. Henry recognized one of them, a railroad employee who'd grown up in Bellwood before moving to the city. They told Henry to store what they were carrying in the post office safe, said it was evidence that needed to be protected until the proper authorities could retrieve it. Henry was a rule follower, trusted institutions the way people used to, so he agreed. Locked everything in that safe and waited for someone official to come collect it. But no one ever came," Margaret said, understanding where this was heading even before Earl confirmed it. "No one ever came. 3 weeks later, Henry read in the newspaper that the investigation had concluded the derailment was an accident, that all cargo had been recovered or accounted for, and that the case was closed. He tried to report what he was holding, called the railroad company and the postal service and even wrote a letter to the FBI. Nobody took him seriously. The official records said everything from that train had been recovered, so Henry must have been confused or lying or trying to insert himself into a story that had nothing to do with him." Earl turned back to face Margaret, and she could see tears gathering in eyes that had probably seen more than their share of tragedy over 83 years. Henry realized what had happened, eventually. The men who'd brought him that shipment weren't protecting evidence. They were hiding stolen property in a location nobody would think to search. The derailment wasn't an accident. It was robbery, planned and executed by people who understood that a small-town post office in the middle of nowhere was the perfect place to stash what they'd taken until the heat died down. But then things went wrong. 2 of the 4 men died in a car accident within a month of the robbery. The 3rd went to prison for an unrelated crime and died there. The 4th, the one Henry recognized, disappeared completely and was never heard from again. The implications of what Earl was saying crashed over Margaret like a wave, leaving her struggling to breathe. "You're telling me that safe contains gold?" From a train robbery 60 years ago? I'm telling you what Henry told me before he died. He never opened the safe after that night in 1962. Said he was afraid of what would happen if he touched it, afraid that somehow acknowledging what was inside would make him complicit in whatever crimes had put it there. He just locked the building when the post office closed, took the combination with him, and spent the rest of his life pretending that safe didn't exist while it haunted every day he had left. Margaret stood, unable to remain seated while her mind raced through calculations and implications that seemed too enormous to process. If Earl was telling the truth, if that safe actually contained gold from a robbery that had happened before she was born, then everything about her situation had just become infinitely more complicated. Gold that valuable would belong to someone, would have insurance claims and legal ownership and the kind of paper trail that didn't disappear just because decades had passed. "Why are you telling me this?" Margaret asked, her voice coming out sharper than she intended. "Why now, after I've already bought this building and moved my son into it?" Earl met her eyes without flinching. "Because Henry asked me to. On his deathbed, he made me promise that if anyone ever bought this building, anyone who seemed decent and honest and capable of making the right choice, I'd tell them the truth. He said the gold had been weighing on his soul for 40 years, and he couldn't die in peace knowing it would just sit there forever, stolen property that never got returned because everyone who could have returned it chose to stay silent instead. The right choice." Margaret almost laughed at the phrase, at the absurd assumption that she knew what the right choice even looked like anymore. She'd spent 18 months making choices that felt less like decisions and more like controlled surrenders, giving up pieces of her life one at a time because holding on to them had become impossible. The right choice had been an illusion she'd stopped believing in around the same time she'd stopped believing that the universe cared whether good people suffered. "If there's gold in that safe worth anything significant, it belongs to whoever insured the original shipment," Margaret said, forcing her voice into something like steadiness. "If I open it and find what you're describing, I'd be legally obligated to report it and turn it over to the proper authorities." "That's true," Earl agreed, his voice gentle but unwavering. "And those proper authorities would probably spend years investigating and litigating and eventually returning whatever they found to insurance companies that have been collecting premiums for decades and wouldn't miss the money anyway. Meanwhile, you and your boy would keep living in a building without heat or electricity, working yourself to death at a job that doesn't pay enough to survive on, and telling yourself that at least you did the right thing." The bitterness in his tone surprised Margaret, revealing an edge she hadn't expected from the gentle old farmer who'd been helping her repair her roof. "That sounds like you're suggesting I shouldn't report it." Earl shook his head slowly. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you what's in that safe, what Henry spent 40 years protecting because he couldn't figure out what else to do with it. What you choose to do with that information is your decision. But I'm also telling you that Henry's honesty didn't help anyone. He followed the rules, tried to report what he had, and got ignored because the official story didn't include a hidden stash of stolen gold in a forgotten post office. He died poor, Margaret. Died in that farmhouse across the road with barely enough money to cover his funeral expenses, because he'd spent his whole life doing the right thing and the right thing had never done anything for him in return." Margaret walked to the safe, placing her palm against the cold steel the way she'd done dozens of times since discovering it. The metal seemed to pulse under her hand, though she knew that was just imagination, just the weight of Earl's words making everything feel more significant than it probably was. A train robbery in 1962. For thieves who'd hidden their take in a post office and then died or disappeared before they could retrieve it. 60 years of secrets locked behind a combination that had died with a man who'd been too honest to profit from what fate had placed in his protection. "Do you know the combination?" Margaret asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Henry gave it to me the day before he died. Wrote it on a piece of paper and made me swear I'd never use it myself, that I'd only pass it on if the right person came along." Earl reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded slip of paper that had clearly been handled many times over the years, the creases worn soft and the edges rounded from being touched and examined and put away again. "I've been holding on to this for 15 years, Margaret. Waiting for someone to buy this building, waiting to see what kind of person would be desperate enough or foolish enough to take on a property that everyone else had written off as worthless. When I saw you and your boy, when I watched you moving in with almost nothing and setting up house in a basement like it was the most natural thing in the world, I knew Henry would have approved. He'd have seen himself in you. Someone who keeps going because the alternative isn't acceptable, even when going means walking into situations you can't control. Margaret took the paper, feeling the weight of it despite its physical lightness. 3 numbers were written in handwriting that had probably been steady once but had grown shaky with age or illness or the emotional burden of what those numbers represented. The combination to a safe that might contain nothing but dust and disappointment. Or might contain something that would change everything about her life and Daniel's future. The gold, she said slowly, if it's really there, if this isn't just a story that got exaggerated over 60 years of retelling. How much are we talking about? Earl's expression shifted into something that might have been sympathy or might have been warning. Henry estimated based on what he'd seen that night, based on the size of the crates and how much they'd weighed. At 1962 prices, he thought it was worth around $4 million. At today's prices, with how much gold has appreciated over the decades. The old man paused, seeming to gather himself before delivering the final number. Somewhere around 140 million. Give or take. The figure was so absurd that Margaret almost dismissed it entirely. $140 million hidden in a safe in an abandoned post office that she'd bought for $350 because she couldn't afford rent on a farmhouse. It sounded like a story people told to amuse themselves, the kind of rural legend that grew more elaborate with each retelling until the original truth was buried under layers of embellishment. But Earl's face showed no trace of amusement, and the paper in Margaret's hand felt heavier than any piece of paper had a right to feel. I need time, Margaret said. I need to think about this before I do anything. Earl nodded, gathering his coat from where he'd draped it over a chair. Take all the time you need. That gold has been sitting in there for 60 years. Another few days or weeks won't matter to anyone except you. He paused at the door, turning back with an expression that Margaret couldn't quite interpret. Henry was a good man who made the choice to protect something he didn't understand and couldn't profit from. He spent his whole life waiting for someone to tell him what to do with it, and no one ever did. Don't make the same mistake, Margaret. Whatever you decide, make sure it's your decision. Not Henry's, not mine, not some government agency that wouldn't help Henry when he tried to do the right thing. Yours. The door closed behind him, and Margaret stood alone in the post office with a piece of paper that might be the key to a fortune or might be the beginning of problems she couldn't begin to imagine. She could hear Daniel's breathing from the basement below, the peaceful rhythm of a child who trusted his mother to figure out whatever needed figuring out. That trust felt heavier than the gold Earl had described, more valuable than any amount of money that might or might not be locked in a safe she now had the combination to open. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She sat in front of the wood stove, feeding it logs to keep the cold at bay, and thought about choices and consequences and the particular cruelty of a universe that kept presenting her with impossible decisions. She thought about Paul, who would have known exactly what to do, who had possessed a moral clarity that Margaret had always envied even when it frustrated her. Paul would have reported the gold immediately, would have trusted the system to handle things properly, would have accepted whatever outcome resulted because he believed that doing right was its own reward regardless of whether that reward came with material benefits. But Paul was dead. Paul's faith in systems and institutions had gotten him a grave in a cemetery and a widow who couldn't afford the headstone he deserved. Margaret had spent 18 months learning that the world didn't reward good behavior, that following rules just meant you suffered while people who broke them prospered, and that the only person she could trust to protect Daniel was herself. The safe sat in the corner of the office, patient and silent, keeping secrets it had held for 6 decades. Margaret could feel its presence even when she wasn't looking at it, a gravitational pull that warped everything around it. She thought about what $140 million could mean. Not just for her and Daniel, but for all the families who were struggling the way she'd struggled, all the children who were growing up in poverty because their parents couldn't catch a single break in a system designed to keep them down. She thought about Earl's words, about Henry dying poor because he'd been too honest to profit from what fate had placed in his possession. And she thought about the 3 numbers written on the paper she still clutched in her hand, The combination that would either confirm Merle's story or expose it as the delusion of an old man who'd spent too many years living alone with nothing but memories for company. Dawn came slowly, gray light creeping through the windows she'd uncovered, revealing dust motes floating in air that smelled like wood smoke and possibility. Daniel emerged from the basement rubbing sleep from his eyes, immediately alert when he saw his mother sitting in the same position she'd been in when he'd gone to bed. "Mom? Did you sleep at all?" Margaret looked at her son, at this boy who'd lost his father and his home and his sense of security, who'd adapted to living in a basement because his mother couldn't provide anything better, who deserved so much more than the life circumstances had forced upon him. She thought about what she could give him if the gold was real, what kind of future she could build if she had resources instead of desperation. "I need to show you something," Margaret said, her voice rough from hours of silence. "And then we need to decide together what we're going to do about it." She told Daniel everything. The train robbery, the hidden gold, Henry's decades of silence, Earl's deathbed promise. She watched her son's face as he processed information that would have seemed fantastical if it hadn't come attached to a piece of paper with 3 numbers that could verify or disprove everything. Daniel listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from confusion to amazement to something that looked remarkably like the practical assessment Margaret had seen on Paul's face when confronting problems that needed solving. "We should open it," Daniel said when she'd finished. "We need to know if it's real before we can decide anything else." The logic was irrefutable in its simplicity. Margaret had been treating the safe as a choice about morality, about right and wrong and what kind of person she wanted to be. But Daniel was right. The first step wasn't choosing what to do with the gold. The first step was confirming whether the gold existed at all. They walked together to the office, mother and son standing in front of the safe that had dominated Margaret's thoughts for weeks. The paper with the combination was damp from Margaret's grip, the numbers slightly smeared but still legible. She read them out loud, her voice barely above a whisper as if speaking too loudly might somehow alert authorities to what they were doing. 3 turns right, 2 turns left, 1 turn right. The mechanism clicked with each position, engineered precision that had survived 6 decades of neglect. The final click was different, something releasing inside the safe that sounded like bones settling. Margaret gripped the handle and pulled, feeling resistance that gradually yielded as hinges that hadn't moved since 1962 protested against motion. The door swung open slowly, revealing darkness that smelled like metal and time and something else Margaret couldn't identify. Daniel had grabbed the flashlight before Margaret could react, directing the beam into the safe's interior with the eagerness of a child who still believed that mysteries were exciting rather than terrifying. The light fell on shapes that took Margaret's brain a moment to interpret, forms that didn't match her expectations of what stolen gold might look like. The safe contained 3 wooden crates, stacked carefully and still bearing stenciled numbers that might have been shipping codes or inventory markers. The wood had darkened with age but remained solid, the craftsmanship evident even after 6 decades. Beside the crates sat a leather satchel that had cracked and dried in the airless environment, its contents visible through gaps in the deteriorated material. Papers. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, documents that had been preserved by the same conditions that had kept the wooden crates intact. Margaret reached for the nearest crate, her hands trembling as she lifted it from the safe. The weight was substantial, far heavier than wood and air would account for, and when she set it on the desk and pried up the lid, the flashlight beam fell on bars that gleamed with the unmistakable luster of precious metal. Gold. Actual gold, stamped with serial numbers and federal markings, packed in straw that had turned to dust over the decades but had protected its cargo from scratches or damage. "Mom," Daniel breathed, his voice carrying awe and fear in equal measure. "It's real. It's actually real." Margaret couldn't speak. She stood frozen, staring at wealth beyond anything she'd imagined, gold that represented security and opportunity and the kind of future she'd stopped allowing herself to dream about. But her eyes kept drifting to the satchel, to the papers that had been stored alongside the gold as if they were equally valuable. She reached for it carefully, the dried leather crumbling under her fingers as she extracted documents that had been waiting 6 decades for someone to read them. The first pages were what she'd expected, shipping manifests and inventory lists that documented the gold's origin and intended destination. But beneath them were other papers, handwritten notes and typed reports and photographs that told a different story than the simple robbery Earl had described. Margaret spread them across the desk, her flashlight revealing details that made her stomach clench with understanding she hadn't anticipated. The train derailment hadn't just been theft. It had been murder. 3 railroad employees had died in the crash, men whose names were listed in incident reports that had been altered before filing. The documents in the satchel were the originals, showing that the switching error was deliberate, that the track damage had been manufactured, and that the whole operation had been designed to look like an accident while 4 men extracted gold from wreckage and disappeared before investigators arrived. But the papers went further. They documented payoffs to local officials who'd helped cover up the true cause of the crash. They named railroad executives who'd known about the robbery in advance and had profited from insurance claims filed on cargo they knew hadn't actually been destroyed. They revealed a conspiracy that extended far beyond 4 thieves hiding gold in a post office, reaching into institutions that were supposed to protect people instead of defrauding them. Henry Marlowe hadn't just been holding stolen gold. He'd been holding evidence of murders and corruption that powerful people had spent 6 decades believing was buried forever. Margaret looked at her son, at the boy who was staring at gold bars worth more than either of them could comprehend, and felt the weight of what they'd discovered pressing down on her with force that made breathing difficult. This wasn't a simple choice between keeping stolen property and returning it to rightful owners. This was something much larger, much more dangerous, and much more complicated than anything she'd prepared herself to face. "Daniel," she said slowly, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. "We need to put everything back in the safe and close it. And then we need to think very carefully about what happens next." Her son looked at her with confusion that gradually shifted to understanding as he recognized the expression on his mother's face. The same expression she'd worn when Paul died, when the landlord delivered the eviction notice, when every crisis that had defined their recent lives had required Margaret to be stronger than she felt capable of being. "It's not just about the gold, is it?" Daniel asked. "No," Margaret confirmed. "It's not just about the gold." She began placing the documents back in the satchel, her hands moving automatically while her mind raced through implications that seemed to multiply with every second. 3 men had died in that train crash, and some with their families might still be alive, might still believe their loved ones had been victims of an accident rather than murder. The people named in these documents had built lives and careers and legacies on foundations of blood money and covered-up crimes. Opening this safe hadn't just revealed treasure. It had uncovered graves. Margaret closed the safe door, spinning the dial to reset the lock, and stood in the gray morning light of a post office that had just become the most dangerous place she'd ever inhabited. She thought about Earl across the road, about the promise he'd kept for 15 years, about Henry Marlowe dying with secrets that had eaten him alive from the inside. And she thought about choices, about the paths that diverged from this moment and where each one might lead. She could take the gold and disappear, could build a new life for herself and Daniel far from anyone who might connect them to what she'd found. She could report everything to authorities, could trust the system that had failed Henry when he tried to do the same thing 60 years ago. Or she could find another way, a path that honored both the truth of what had happened and the practical reality of what her family needed to survive. The decision felt impossibly heavy, pressing down on shoulders that had already been carrying too much for too long. But Margaret had learned something about herself during 18 months of widowhood and poverty and the slow erosion of everything she thought her life would become. She'd learned that she was stronger than she'd ever believed possible, that she could survive things that should have destroyed her, and that protecting Daniel was a purpose that made every other consideration secondary. Whatever she decided about the gold and the documents and the secrets that had been hiding in this building for 60 years, she would make that decision based on what was best for her son. Not what was legal or moral or expected, but what would give Daniel the best chance at a future that didn't involve the kind of suffering Margaret had experienced. The sun was fully up now, light streaming through windows that hadn't seen illumination in 4 decades. Margaret put her arm around Daniel's shoulders and guided him away from the safe, away from decisions that could wait until she'd had time to think clearly about consequences she couldn't yet fully imagine. "Let's get breakfast started," she said, her voice carrying a calm she didn't feel. "We have a lot to talk about, but first we need to eat. Your father always said you couldn't make good decisions on an empty stomach." Daniel nodded, accepting his mother's deflection with the trust of a child who'd learned that sometimes adults needed time before they could explain things properly. They walked together toward the camp stove and the supplies that represented their meager resources, leaving behind a safe that now contained not just gold but the weight of choices that would determine everything about their future. Outside, across the road, Earl Whitmore stood on his porch watching the post office with an expression that combined hope and fear in equal measure. He'd passed on Henry's burden, had fulfilled the promise he'd been carrying for 15 years. Now all he could do was wait and see what kind of person Margaret Holloway would prove to be when forced to choose between survival and something larger than herself. Margaret spent 3 days reading the documents before she allowed herself to make a decision. She told Daniel they needed to wait, needed to understand exactly what they were dealing with before taking any action that couldn't be undone. Her son had accepted this with the patience he'd inherited from his father, occupying himself with repairs to the post office while Margaret sat in the office with papers spread across the desk, piecing together a story that had been waiting 60 years to be understood. The 3 men who'd died in the train derailment were named Thomas Bearden, William Croft, and Samuel Reyes. They'd been railroad employees working the mail car that night, responsible for the registered cargo that included the gold shipment nobody was supposed to know about. The documents included their personnel files, copies that shouldn't have existed outside railroad offices, showing that all 3 had been married with children. Thomas Bearden had 4 kids, the oldest only 12 when his father died. William Croft's wife had been pregnant with their second child, a baby he'd never meet. Samuel Reyes had been supporting his elderly mother along with his own family, sending money home to a village in Mexico where his parents had grown too old to work. Margaret read their files until she'd memorized details that transformed them from names on a page into real people whose lives had been stolen by men who'd valued gold over human existence. She thought about their children, now in their 60s and 70s if they were still alive, people who'd grown up without fathers because someone had decided that $4 million was worth more than 3 lives. The weight of that knowledge settled into Margaret's bones alongside all the other weights she'd been carrying, adding itself to the burden that had been growing heavier since Paul died. The conspiracy documents were harder to process, revealing a web of corruption that had extended from the railroad company through local government and into federal agencies that should have investigated the derailment properly. Payoffs had been made to county officials who'd signed off on the accident report without questioning inconsistencies that should have been obvious. Railroad executives had collected insurance payments on cargo they'd known was stolen rather than destroyed, turning the robbery into a profit center that had funded bonuses and promotions for men whose names Margaret didn't recognize but who'd built careers on the deaths of Thomas Bearden, William Croft, and Samuel Reyes. On the 4th morning, Margaret walked across the road to Earl Whitmore's farmhouse and asked if he could watch Daniel for a few hours. The old man had agreed without asking where she was going, understanding perhaps that some journeys needed to be made alone. Margaret drove 40 miles to the county seat, parked outside the public library, and spent 6 hours researching names from the documents she'd photographed with her phone. Most of the conspirators were dead. The railroad executives had passed away decades ago, their obituaries celebrating lives of achievement and philanthropy built on foundations of fraud and murder. The county officials had died too, local men who'd taken bribes and looked away while 3 families buried fathers who shouldn't have been in coffins. Time had delivered a kind of justice that the legal system had failed to provide, claiming everyone who'd profited from the robbery before any of them could face accountability for what they'd done. But not everyone was gone. Margaret found records showing that one of the railroad executives had a son who was still alive, a man named Richard Harmon who'd inherited his father's wealth and expanded it into a real estate empire that now controlled properties across 3 states. She found descendants of the county officials too, families that had prospered in the decades since the robbery, their success fertilized by money that had been paid to ensure 3 murders were never investigated properly. And she found the families of the dead men. Thomas Bearden's children had scattered after his death, the oldest taking over as head of household at 12 years old, working jobs that should have gone to adults while trying to keep his siblings together. 3 of them were still alive, living in different parts of the country, connected only by the shared trauma of losing their father in what they'd always believed was an accident. William Croft's daughter, the one who'd been born after his death, had grown up in poverty after his railroad pension was denied due to administrative complications that the documents suggested had been deliberate. Samuel Reyes's family had returned to Mexico after his death, unable to survive without his income, and Margaret couldn't find any trace of what had happened to them afterward. She drove home in darkness, her mind churning with information that demanded action she couldn't quite define. The gold in the safe was stolen property, but returning it to insurance companies felt like allowing the conspiracy to claim a final victory. The documents were evidence of crimes, but the perpetrators were dead and the statutes of limitations had expired decades ago. Justice in any traditional sense was impossible. The question was whether some other form of accounting might still be achievable. Daniel was asleep when Margaret returned, Earl having fed him dinner and helped him with homework before settling the boy on his basement mattress with a promise that his mother would be home soon. The old man was waiting in the main room of the post office, a fire burning in the wood stove and coffee warming on the camp burner. He didn't ask what Margaret had learned during her trip, just handed her a cup and waited while she gathered thoughts that had been scattering like leaves in wind all day. "The families of the men who died," Margaret said finally. "The Beardens and the Crofts and the Reyes family. They never knew what really happened. They spent 60 years believing their fathers and husbands died in an accident, when really they were murdered so 4 men could steal gold that's been sitting in this building ever since." Earl nodded slowly, his weathered face showing the weight of truths he'd been carrying since Henry Marlowe had shared them 15 years ago. Henry wanted to tell them. Spent years trying to figure out how to contact the families and explain what really happened. But he was afraid. Afraid they wouldn't believe him, afraid he'd just be reopening wounds that had healed over, afraid that knowing the truth would hurt them more than the comfort of believing it was an accident. That wasn't his decision to make, Margaret said, and the words came out harder than she'd intended. Those families deserve to know. Deserve to know. The truth about how someone died isn't something you get to hide from the people who love them, no matter how much you think you're protecting them. Earl flinched at the accusation implicit in Margaret's tone, recognizing that she was condemning him as much as Henry. He'd kept the same secret for 15 years, had made the same choice to stay silent that Henry had made for the 4 decades before that. 2 men, 2 generations, both deciding that their own comfort mattered more than the right of grieving families to understand what had really happened to the people they'd lost. "You're right," Earl said quietly. "I told myself I was honoring Henry's wishes, protecting his memory, waiting for the right moment. But I was just scared. Scared of what would happen if I spoke up, scared that I'd be blamed for keeping quiet so long, scared that the truth would cause more problems than it solved." He met Margaret's eyes with an expression that combined shame and something that might have been relief. "I've been waiting for someone else to make the decision I couldn't make myself. That's why I told you about the safe. Not just because Henry asked me to, but because I needed someone braver than me to finally do what should have been done 60 years ago." Margaret thought about bravery, about what it meant to make choices that mattered when the consequences couldn't be predicted or controlled. She'd spent 18 months believing she wasn't brave, that she was just surviving because the alternative was abandoning a son who needed her. But maybe survival was its own kind of courage. Maybe showing up every day for a life that had become almost unbearable was braver than the dramatic gestures that stories celebrated. "I'm going to contact the families," Margaret said, the decision crystallizing as she spoke it aloud. "The Beardens and the Crofts, at least. I couldn't find the Reyes family, but I'll keep looking. They deserve to know the truth about what happened to their fathers, and they deserve to decide for themselves what to do with that information." Earl's expression shifted, something like hope flickering in eyes that had grown accustomed to disappointment. "And the gold? The documents about the conspiracy? The gold goes to the families of the men who died getting it. Equal shares to the Beardens, the Crofts, and the Reyes family if I can find them. It won't bring their fathers back, won't compensate for 60 years of not knowing the truth, but it's something. and the documents go public. Every newspaper, every historical society, every archive that will take them. The people who covered up those murders are dead, but their families are still profiting from what they did. The least I can do is make sure everyone knows where that money really came from. The plan felt inadequate even as Margaret articulated it, a partial solution to a problem that was too large and too old for any response to feel sufficient. But partial solutions were better than continued silence, and action was better than the paralysis that had trapped Henry Marlowe and Earl Whitmore for decades before her. The next months were the hardest of Margaret's life, and that was saying something given the 18 months that had preceded them. She contacted the Bearden family first, tracked down Thomas's oldest son through a chain of public records and social media searches that took weeks of patient investigation. The man's name was Robert Bearden, and he was 73 years old, living in a small town in Ohio where he'd retired after 40 years working as a machinist. When Margaret called him and explained who she was and why she was reaching out, the silence on the other end of the line had stretched so long she thought he'd hung up. Robert had listened to her entire story without interrupting, his breathing the only indication that he was still on the line. When Margaret finished, when she'd explained about the safe and the gold and the documents that proved his father had been murdered rather than killed in an accident, Robert had asked a single question: "Why are you telling me this? What do you want?" The question had cut to the heart of everything Margaret had been wrestling with since opening the safe. What did she want? The gold could have transformed her life and Daniel's future, could have provided security that she'd never known and opportunities that poverty had always denied. She could have taken it and disappeared, could have built something for her family without anyone ever knowing that 3 men had died so that wealth could exist. "I want you to know the truth about your father," Margaret had said, and the words had felt right even as they cost her everything the gold represented. "And I want you to have what those men stole, or at least your family's share of it. I can't undo what happened or bring your father back, but I can make sure his death isn't forgotten and that his family benefits from the gold he died protecting." The conversation with Robert Bearden had been the first of many. Margaret had contacted the Croft family next, reaching William's daughter who'd been born after his death, a woman named Patricia who'd spent her entire life wondering about the father she'd never met. Patricia had cried when Margaret told her the truth, had sobbed through an hour-long phone call as 60 years of questions finally received answers that were terrible but at least real. The Reyes family proved harder to find, but Margaret eventually traced Samuel's descendants to a town in Chihuahua where his grandchildren still lived, still carrying stories about the grandfather who'd gone north to work and never come home. The legal process of distributing the gold took longer than Margaret had anticipated, requiring lawyers and appraisers and court proceedings that consumed most of the following year. Margaret had been transparent from the beginning, had reported everything to authorities who'd been skeptical at first but had gradually accepted the documentation she provided. The insurance companies that had paid claims on the stolen gold had long since written off the loss, their actuarial tables having absorbed the theft decades ago. When Margaret's lawyer explained that she intended to distribute the recovered gold to the families of the murdered railroad workers, the companies had declined to contest the arrangement, calculating that fighting a 70-year-old widow and the families of murder victims would generate publicity that cost more than the gold was worth. The distribution had happened on a Tuesday in April, 14 months after Margaret had opened the safe for the first time. Representatives from all 3 families had gathered at the post office, the Beardens and the Crofts traveling from across the country, the Reyes family sending 2 of Samuel's grandchildren who'd made the journey from Mexico to receive their inheritance. Margaret had watched them meet each other for the first time, these strangers connected by tragedy they'd never fully understood, and had felt something shift in her chest that might have been closure or might have been the beginning of something she didn't yet have words for. The gold had been divided equally, each family receiving a share worth just over $46 million after the appreciation of 60 years had been calculated. The money was life-changing for all of them, transforming circumstances that had been shaped by the loss of fathers and husbands who'd died too young. Robert Bearden had used his share to establish a scholarship fund in his father's name, providing education for children from families that had lost breadwinners to industrial accidents. Patricia Croft had funded a memorial at the site of the train derailment, a small park with benches and plaques that told the true story of what had happened there in 1962. The Reyes grandchildren had taken their share back to Mexico, where they'd built a community center and medical clinic that served the village their grandfather had been supporting when he died. Margaret had kept nothing from the gold itself, had signed documents relinquishing any claim to wealth she'd never felt entitled to possess. But the families had insisted on providing something in return, had pooled resources to fund the renovation of the post office into a proper home for Margaret and Daniel. The work had taken 6 months, transforming the abandoned building into a space that was warm and comfortable and filled with light that streamed through windows that had been dark for 4 decades. Daniel was 13 now, tall enough that he'd outgrown his father's jacket and confident in ways that the frightened boy who'd moved into a basement hadn't been. He'd learned to tend a garden under Earl's patient instruction, had helped his mother navigate the complications of transforming stolen gold into legitimate inheritance, had written school essays about his experiences that had earned recognition from teachers who'd never expected much from a poor kid living in a converted post office. The boy had inherited his father's optimism along with his mother's determination, combining them into something that felt like hope made practical, like faith that had learned to build instead of just believe. Earl Whitmore had not lived to see the renovation completed. The old man had passed away in his sleep during the winter, peacefully and without pain, surrounded by the photographs of family members who'd preceded him and the knowledge that the burden he'd carried for 15 years had finally been lifted. Margaret had organized his funeral, had ensured that his contribution to uncovering the truth was recognized in obituaries that celebrated a man who'd spent his final months watching something he'd helped create take shape across the road from the house where he'd lived his entire life. Earl had left his property to Margaret in a will that surprised no one who'd watched the relationship develop between them. The farmhouse and the land it occupied now belonged to her and Daniel, expanding their holdings into something that resembled the farm Paul had always dreamed of building. Margaret had planted the first crops that spring, vegetables and flowers that would feed them and beautify the crossroads that had once been the heart of Bellwood County. The work was hard and the learning curve steep, but Margaret had discovered that she liked the feeling of soil under her fingernails, the satisfaction of watching things grow because she'd provided what they needed to thrive. The documents Margaret had preserved had traveled further than she'd anticipated. Historians and journalists had picked up the story, had traced connections between the 1962 robbery and patterns of corruption that had extended beyond Bellwood County into institutions that people had trusted without question. The descendants of the officials who'd taken bribes had faced public scrutiny that couldn't result in legal consequences but had damaged reputations that had been built on foundations of silence and complicity. Richard Harmon, the son of the railroad executive who'd profited from the conspiracy, had been forced to address questions about the origins of his family's wealth, had eventually donated significant portions of that wealth to causes that supported victims of corporate misconduct. Margaret stood in the garden on a morning in October, 3 years after she'd bought the post office for $350, watching mist rise from fields that now belonged to her and remembering all the moments that had led to this one. Daniel was beside her, helping to harvest vegetables that would stock their root cellar for winter, moving with the easy competence of a boy who'd learned that work was its own reward regardless of what it produced. The post office gleamed behind them, stone walls that had witnessed decades of service and abandonment and now witnessed something that felt like resurrection. She thought about Paul sometimes, wondered what he would have made of the choices she'd made and the life she'd built from materials he couldn't have imagined. Paul would have been proud, she decided. Not because she'd done everything right, not because her decisions had been morally pure or legally unambiguous, but because she'd kept going. She'd taken impossible circumstances and transformed them into something that mattered, had honored the dead while building futures for the living, had proved that one person's choices could ripple outward in ways that changed more than just their own small corner of the world. The crossroads had changed in the years since Margaret's arrival. Other families had moved into abandoned buildings that dotted the landscape, had taken inspiration from her example and begun reclaiming structures that everyone else had written off as beyond saving. A small store had opened in what had been a derelict barn, selling locally grown produce and handmade goods to travelers who increasingly used this route because word had spread about the community taking shape here. The elementary school 3 miles away had seen enrollment increase for the first time in decades, children of families who'd found affordable housing in buildings that previous owners had abandoned to decay. Margaret had started something without fully intending to, had demonstrated that forgotten places could be remembered and that value existed in spaces that markets had declared worthless. The post office had become a symbol of that possibility, a physical reminder that desperation could be transformed into determination and that choosing right over easy sometimes produced rewards that exceeded anything money could have provided. Daniel finished loading vegetables into the basket they'd brought and straightened, his expression carrying satisfaction that Margaret recognized because she felt it too. They'd built this together, mother and son surviving circumstances that should have destroyed them and emerging with something that felt like legacy instead of just survival. "Do you think Dad would have liked what we've done here?" Daniel asked, the question carrying the particular weight of a teenager trying to connect with a father he was beginning to forget despite his best efforts to remember. Margaret looked at her son, at this young man who carried pieces of both his parents in ways that became more visible with every year that passed. She thought about Paul's dreams and her own fears, about the 1,000 small choices that had accumulated into the life they were living now. "I think your father would have loved this place," Margaret said. "Not because of the buildings or the land or even the story of how we got here, but because we're still together. Because we didn't give up when giving up would have been easier. Because we found a way to matter in a world that kept telling us we didn't." Daniel nodded, accepting his mother's words with the trust that had survived poverty and displacement and the revelation of secrets that had been hidden for decades. They walked together toward the post office, toward home and warmth and the work that would continue tomorrow because living things required constant tending regardless of how established they appeared. The land stretched around them in the October light, fields that remembered everyone who'd ever worked them and buildings that held stories in their walls and foundations. Margaret had added her own chapter to those stories, had taken what she'd found and transformed it into something that would outlast her own presence the same way Henry Marlowe's secret had outlasted him. Legacy wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic sacrifices, Margaret had learned. It was about the daily choice to keep trying, to keep building, to keep believing that effort mattered even when evidence suggested otherwise. It was about raising a son who understood that integrity was worth more than wealth, about creating community from isolation, about proving that forgotten places and forgotten people could write new stories if given the chance. The post office door opened easily now, hinges that Margaret had oiled and maintained swinging without the protests that had greeted her first entry. Inside, the wood stove radiated heat into a space that had been transformed from abandonment into habitation, from decay into something that felt like home. Photographs lined the walls, images of Paul and Daniel and Earl and the families who'd gathered to receive the gold that had been hidden here for 60 years. The faces looked out at Margaret with expressions that captured moments of joy and grief and everything between, a visual record of lives that had intersected with her own in ways that none of them could have predicted. Margaret set down the vegetable basket and stood for a moment in the warmth, feeling the weight of everything she'd experienced and everything still to come. She was 40 years old now, no longer young but not yet old, with decades ahead that she could fill with whatever purposes she chose. Daniel would grow up and leave eventually, would build his own life and legacy somewhere that might or might not include this crossroads that had saved them both. The post office would remain, stone walls enduring weather and time the way they'd been designed to, waiting for whoever came next to add their own chapter to its long history. But for now, in this moment, Margaret was home. She'd built something from nothing, had transformed desperation into determination and impossible choices into outcomes that honored both the living and the dead. The mail train gold had been distributed to families who'd waited 60 years for justice they'd never known to expect. The truth about 3 murdered men had been told to a world that had mostly stopped caring but that now, at least, had the chance to remember. And Margaret Holloway, broke widow who'd bought an abandoned post office because she couldn't afford rent anywhere else, had discovered that sometimes the most reckless decisions were the ones that changed everything. That sometimes the land gave back what it had taken, offered redemption to people brave enough to demand it, and remembered everyone who'd ever fought to survive within its boundaries. Daniel called from the kitchen, asking about dinner, his voice carrying the casual certainty of a boy who trusted that his mother would provide what was needed. Margaret smiled and walked toward that voice, toward the ordinary demands of daily life that had once felt crushing but now felt like privilege. She'd learned that legacy was built from small moments accumulated over time, from choices made when no one was watching and sacrifices that nobody celebrated. The post office had taught her that, and Paul had taught her that, and Earl had taught her that, and even Henry Marlowe, dead for 15 years, had taught her that through documents he'd preserved because he couldn't bring himself to destroy evidence of crimes he lacked the courage to expose. Margaret had found that courage. Not because she was braver than Henry or Earl or anyone else who'd touched this story over 60 years, but because she'd had nothing left to lose except a son who deserved better than the fear of trying. She'd gambled everything on a building everyone else had abandoned, and the building had rewarded that faith with secrets that transformed not just her life but the lives of families she'd never met. The October sun was setting behind the ridge, painting the stone walls of the post office in shades of gold that made the old building look almost new. Margaret stood at the window watching light fade into dusk, thinking about all the sunsets this building had witnessed and all the ones still to come. She'd become part of its story now, woven into walls that remembered everything. And that felt like enough. That felt like legacy. That felt like exactly what she'd been searching for since the day her husband died and left her alone with a son and a future that had seemed impossible to face. The crossroads held its secrets and its promises, its memories and its hopes. And Margaret Holloway, who'd bought redemption for $350 without knowing what she was purchasing, had finally found a home worthy of everything she'd survived to reach it. 5 years after Margaret Holloway opened a safe that had been locked for 6 decades, the crossroads at Bellwood Station had become something that maps couldn't adequately describe. The post office still stood at its center, stone walls that had witnessed mail coaches and Model Ts and decades of abandonment now witnessing something that felt like resurrection. The building had aged gracefully under Margaret's care, its honey-colored stones cleaned and repointed, its windows gleaming with glass that caught morning light and scattered it across gardens that had transformed the gravel lot into something approaching beauty. Flowers grew where weeds had once claimed territory, vegetables thrived in raised beds that Daniel had built from salvaged lumber, and the iron sign above the door had been restored to legibility, the words Bellwood Station now visible to travelers who increasingly chose this route because they'd heard about the community taking shape here. Margaret was 45 years old now, her hair showing streaks of gray that she'd stopped trying to hide and her face carrying lines that told the story of everything she'd survived. She moved more slowly than she had 5 years ago, her body having accumulated the kind of wear that came from physical labor and emotional weight carried too long without adequate rest. But she moved with purpose, with the deliberate grace of someone who'd learned that every day was borrowed time and that borrowed time was best spent on things that mattered. She'd stopped working at the feed store 3 years ago, had transitioned into managing the small cooperative that had formed around the crossroads, coordinating the efforts of families who'd followed her example and reclaimed abandoned buildings that previous generations had written off as beyond saving. Daniel was 18 now, preparing to leave for a university that had offered him a scholarship based on essays he'd written about growing up in a converted post office and watching his mother transform desperation into something that changed lives beyond their own. The boy had become a young man without Margaret quite noticing the transition, his voice deepening and his shoulders broadening until he resembled his father in ways that sometimes made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. He still wore Paul's jacket occasionally, though it fit him properly now, the sleeves no longer needing to be rolled and the fabric stretched across shoulders that had grown into the garment's dimensions. The jacket had become a talisman rather than a necessity, a connection to a father whose memory had softened from sharp grief into gentle presence. The morning of Daniel's departure arrived with the kind of October light that made everything look significant, golden rays slanting through windows that had once been boarded against a world that had forgotten this place existed. Margaret had been awake since before dawn, moving through the post office with the restless energy of someone facing a transition they'd known was coming but hadn't fully prepared to experience. She'd made breakfast, had packed sandwiches for Daniel's drive, had checked and rechecked the supplies she'd assembled for his dorm room until the activity had become obvious avoidance of the goodbye that was rapidly approaching. Daniel found her in the garden, standing among tomato plants that had finished producing for the season and were beginning the slow decline toward winter dormancy. He didn't say anything at first, just stood beside her the way he'd learned to do during years when words had been inadequate for the emotions they'd been navigating together. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with understanding that didn't require articulation. "You're going to be fine," Margaret said finally, though she wasn't sure if she was reassuring Daniel or herself. "You're ready for this. You've been ready for a while now." Daniel nodded, his expression carrying the particular mixture of excitement and anxiety that accompanied major life transitions. "I know. It's just strange, leaving after everything we've built here. This place was supposed to be temporary, remember? Just somewhere to stay while you figured out what to do next." Margaret smiled at the memory of those first desperate weeks, sleeping in the basement on mattresses dragged from a farmhouse they could no longer afford, hauling water from Earl's well because utilities hadn't been connected yet. The post office had been a last resort, a building nobody wanted in a location nobody cared about, and Margaret had purchased it with money she couldn't afford to lose because all the alternatives had been worse. Now it was home in ways that transcended the physical structure, a place that held memories and meaning and the accumulated evidence of choices that had transformed not just their circumstances but their understanding of what was possible. "Temporary has a way of becoming permanent when you stop fighting it," Margaret said. "Your father taught me that. He was always planning for the farm we'd own someday, always looking ahead to futures that never quite arrived. But he was happy in the present, too. Happy with what we had even while working toward what we wanted. I didn't understand that until after he was gone." Daniel was quiet for a moment, processing words that connected to griefs he'd been carrying since he was 9 years old. "Do you think he would have liked how things turned out? Not just the post office, but everything. The families who got the gold, the truth coming out about what happened to those railroad workers, the community that's formed here." Margaret considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, thinking about the man she'd loved and lost and continued loving despite the years that separated them. Paul had been idealistic in ways that Margaret had always admired even when they'd frustrated her, believing that doing right would eventually produce right outcomes regardless of how long the eventually took to arrive. He'd have understood immediately why Margaret had given up the gold, would have supported that choice without hesitation even though it meant continuing to struggle when struggle could have been avoided. "I think your father would have been proud," Margaret said. "Not because everything worked out, but because we tried to make it work out. Because we chose integrity over convenience and trusted that the choice would matter even when we couldn't see how." She paused, feeling the weight of years pressing against words that wanted to be spoken. "He would have been proud of you, Daniel. Prouder than I can express. You've become exactly the kind of person he hoped you'd become, and you did it while carrying losses that would have broken most people." Daniel's eyes had grown bright with moisture he was trying not to shed, the emotional control of an 18-year-old who'd learned that crying was acceptable but still felt uncomfortable doing it in front of others. Margaret reached out and pulled him into an embrace that he returned with the kind of fierce grip that communicated everything words couldn't capture. They stood together in the garden, mother and son saying goodbye to a chapter of their lives that had been defined by proximity and shared struggle, preparing to enter a new chapter where distance would require different forms of connection. The hug lasted longer than either of them had intended, neither wanting to be the first to let go. When they finally separated, both were wiping eyes and pretending they weren't, the small deceptions that families use to protect each other from the full weight of emotions that threaten to overwhelm. "I'll be back for Thanksgiving," Daniel said, his voice rough but steady. "And Christmas. And probably every other weekend if I can manage it." Margaret laughed, the sound carrying relief and joy in the particular pride that came from raising a child who wanted to return home even when home had been an abandoned post office in the middle of nowhere. "You'll be busy with classes and friends and all the things that college is supposed to involve. Don't spend all your time driving back here just because you're worried about me." "I'm not worried about you," Daniel said, and the words carried conviction that Margaret recognized as genuine rather than performative. "You're the strongest person I know. You've survived things that would have destroyed anyone else, and you've done it while building something that matters. I'm coming back because I want to, not because I think you need me to." The distinction mattered in ways that Margaret was still learning to appreciate. She'd spent so many years being needed, being responsible for Daniel's survival and well-being, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be wanted for reasons that had nothing to do with necessity. Her son was choosing to maintain connection not out of obligation but out of love, and that choice validated years of sacrifice that had sometimes felt pointless in their darkest moments. Daniel loaded his car with the efficiency of a young man who'd learned to travel light because circumstances had never allowed for accumulation. His possessions fit easily into the back seat and trunk, boxes of books and clothes and the few personal items that had survived the transitions from farmhouse to basement to the home they'd built together. Margaret stood on the porch watching him work, memorizing details she'd be replaying during the quiet evenings ahead when his absence would make the post office feel larger and emptier than it had any right to feel. The goodbye itself was brief, both of them having said what needed saying during the moment in the garden. Daniel hugged his mother one final time, climbed into his car, and drove away with a wave that Margaret returned until the vehicle had disappeared around the curve that led toward the highway. She stood on the porch for a long time after he'd gone, watching the road as if he might change his mind and come back, knowing he wouldn't, and proud of him for having the courage to leave. The crossroads felt different with Daniel gone, quieter in ways that had nothing to do with actual sound levels. Margaret had grown accustomed to his presence over 18 years, had organized her life around his needs and schedules and the particular rhythms that came from sharing space with another person. Now she had to learn new rhythms, had to discover who she was when she wasn't primarily defined by motherhood and the responsibilities that role entailed. The community helped with that transition in ways Margaret hadn't anticipated. The families who'd settled around the crossroads had become something like extended family over the years, people who shared meals and labor and the particular bond that formed between those who'd chosen to build lives in places others had abandoned. They appeared at Margaret's door in the days after Daniel left, bringing food and conversation and the kind of companionship that prevented solitude from curdling into loneliness. They'd learned from Margaret's example that community was built through showing up, through being present during transitions that might otherwise become overwhelming, through treating each other's struggles as shared responsibilities rather than individual burdens. The cooperative Margaret had helped establish now included 12 families, people who'd purchased abandoned properties throughout the county and were transforming them into homes and businesses and gathering places that served needs the broader economy had forgotten existed. A bakery operated from a converted barn 3 miles north of the crossroads, producing bread and pastries that attracted customers from towns that had supermarkets and chain restaurants but lacked anything made with the kind of attention that small batch production allowed. A furniture workshop occupied a former schoolhouse, crafting pieces from salvaged wood that carried histories in their grain patterns and imperfections. A small inn had opened in what had been a derelict farmhouse, providing accommodations for travelers who'd heard about the community and wanted to experience what was being built here. Margaret had become the unofficial coordinator of these efforts, not because she'd sought leadership but because her story had established credibility that others leveraged when approaching banks for loans or government agencies for permits. The woman who'd bought a post office for $350 and turned it into a catalyst for regional revival had become a symbol of what was possible when desperation was channeled into determination rather than defeat. Journalists still contacted her occasionally, wanting to write follow-up stories about the gold and the families who'd received it and the community that had formed in the aftermath. Margaret accommodated these requests when they seemed likely to help others learn from her experience, declined them when they felt more interested in spectacle than substance. The families of the murdered railroad workers had stayed in touch over the years, connected to Margaret by bonds that transcended the financial transaction that had brought them together. Robert Bearden had visited the crossroads twice, standing in the post office where his father's murderers had hidden their spoils and thanking Margaret for having the courage to expose what generations of silence had concealed. Patricia Croft sent Christmas cards every year, photographs of grandchildren who existed partly because the gold Margaret had returned had provided stability that Patricia's family had lacked for decades. The Reyes family had established a scholarship in Margaret's name, funding education for students from rural communities who demonstrated the kind of resilience that Margaret had embodied when she transformed an abandoned building into a home. The memorial Patricia had funded at the site of the train derailment had become a place Margaret visited occasionally, standing among benches and plaques that told the true story of what had happened in 1962. The park was quiet and well-maintained, a small oasis of remembrance in a landscape that had mostly forgotten the events it commemorated. Margaret would sit there sometimes, thinking about Thomas Bearden and William Croft and Samuel Reyes, men she'd never met but whose deaths had shaped her life in ways none of them could have imagined. She'd given their families closure and resources, had ensured their sacrifice wasn't forgotten, had transformed tragedy into something that approached redemption even though redemption could never fully compensate for lives cut short. Earl Whitmore's farmhouse across the road from the post office had become a community center, the building Margaret had inherited serving purposes that Earl would have approved. Meetings happened there, and classes, and the kind of informal gatherings that built relationships between people who might otherwise have remained strangers. Margaret had preserved Earl's vegetable garden, had expanded it into a teaching space where children learned about growing food and adults learned about the patience required to coax abundance from soil that had been neglected for generations. The garden produced more than any single family could consume, surplus that was shared among community members and donated to food banks in nearby towns where poverty persisted despite the revival happening at the crossroads. The October evening settled into the kind of darkness that rural places held, stars emerging in skies unpolluted by the light that cities generated. Margaret sat on the porch of the post office, wrapped in a blanket against the chill, watching constellations that had watched over this crossroads for longer than human memory could track. She thought about Daniel driving toward his new life, about Paul resting in the cemetery 3 miles away, about Earl and Henry Marlowe and the 3 railroad workers whose deaths had ultimately funded the transformation she'd helped create. All of them were part of her story now, woven into a narrative that had begun with desperation and evolved into something that felt like purpose. The post office had taught Margaret that buildings held memories, that walls absorbed the experiences of everyone who'd passed through them and released those memories slowly to those patient enough to listen. She could feel the history in these stones, the decades of service followed by decades of abandonment followed by the years of revival she'd initiated. The building had waited for someone to care about it, had preserved its secrets until a person desperate enough to take a chance had finally appeared. Margaret had been that person, had become the bridge between what the post office had been and what it was becoming. She thought about legacy as the stars wheeled overhead, about what would remain when she was gone the way Earl was gone and Paul was gone and all the people whose choices had accumulated into the present moment. Daniel would carry forward what she'd taught him, would build his own life informed by values she'd demonstrated through action rather than lecture. The community would continue evolving, families adding their own chapters to a story that had begun long before Margaret arrived and would continue long after she departed. The post office would stand, stone walls enduring weather and time, waiting for future generations to add their own meanings to meanings that had been accumulating since the first stones were laid. Margaret had learned that legacy wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic sacrifices. It was about the daily choice to show up, to keep trying, to believe that effort mattered even when results weren't visible. It was about treating other people's struggles as worthy of attention, about building community from isolation, about proving that forgotten places and forgotten people could write new stories if given the chance. She'd built her legacy from materials that others had discarded, had transformed abandonment into belonging, had demonstrated that desperation could become determination when channeled toward purposes larger than individual survival. The night deepened around her, October cold settling into bones that had carried too much weight for too many years. Margaret pulled the blanket tighter and continued watching stars that had watched over countless other people sitting on countless other porches, contemplating their own small place in histories that stretched beyond comprehension. She felt connected to all of them, to everyone who'd ever looked up at the same sky and wondered what their choices might mean to people they'd never meet. Tomorrow would bring new work and new challenges, the endless demands of maintaining community and coordinating efforts and being present for people who'd come to rely on her example. But tonight was for remembering, for honoring, for sitting with the weight of everything that had happened and everything still to come. The crossroads held its silence, patient and eternal, waiting for morning to bring whatever morning would bring. And Margaret Holloway, who'd bought redemption for $350 without knowing what she was purchasing, sat in the darkness feeling grateful for every choice that had led her to this moment, this place, this life that had exceeded anything she'd dared to imagine when desperation had been the only compass she possessed. The land remembered everything. The soil held stories. And Margaret had added her chapter to histories that would continue long after she was gone, her legacy written in stone walls and garden beds and the faces of children growing up in a community that existed because one broke widow had refused to surrender when surrender would have been easier. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.